Hi, it's Attorney General Josh Stein with the latest edition of Civics with Stein. And I want to pick up on the heels of what we talked about last week, which was the market-based economy that we have here in the United States. And I mentioned how sometimes markets don't work properly. Sometimes they fail. And when they do, they don't produce an efficient or the right outcome. And it requires the intervention of some entity to fix it. And that's the role of government. So some examples is having huge disparity in wealth and income, that kind of income inequality. Things we do to address that is ensuring that everyone has opportunity to get a good public education to try to take that next step up the ladder. We ensure folks have basic needs, whether it's access to health insurance or retirement system through the Social Security system, that their basic needs are met. Or having a progressive taxation system where the more somebody earns, the more they're taxed, so that those funds can be used to support all the important work of government. Another instance of the markets not working right is when the gains of an activity go to some private actor, but the costs of that activity are borne by all of us. And the classic example of that is pollution. The polluter gets all the money of selling whatever they're doing, but they're not having to pay to keep it clean. That's why we have the Clean Air Act. That's why we have the Clean Water Act. And I'm actually using those laws to go after polluters to make them pay to clean up the messes they create. A third type of market failure is when there's a real imbalance between the parties. A market system assumes that there is a freedom of choice between consumers and producers, and that's not always the case. Sometimes you have these standard form contracts, or otherwise known as contracts of adhesion, where the consumer really doesn't have any bargaining power. It just is what it is, and they either have to accept it or not, and sometimes those aren't in people's interests. One thing I did is in employment contracts, there were some provisions that required employees to keep confidential any settlement to deal with sexual harassment. I think that's wrong. You shouldn't be able to pay to keep some harasser not public, and then they may run the risk of going after someone else. So that's an example of that. Another type of unfair contract is price gouging. When there is a state of emergency, there's a huge imbalance between someone who's in desperation and someone who can supply whatever good or service is needed. So in the coronavirus circumstance, we've received over 1,500 price gouging complaints, and we're investigating them. And we have investigative demands out to sellers because they have something that people desperately need, and some of them are violating our law. They're charging an unreasonably excessive price, and we will go after them when we find it. After the last couple of hurricanes, we went after we did 7 different cases, 22 different defendants, and we won settlements and awards that returned back to North Carolina consumers nearly $750,000. And so when there's a state of emergency, making sure price gouging doesn't go on, that's another role we play in government. And finally, another example of market failure is when there's a lack of competition. If there's a monopoly in a market, that monopoly player has the ability to charge whatever they want because there's no one to compete against them to keep the prices down. Just a week or two ago, y'all may remember the guy, Farmer Bro, Martin Shkreli. I sued him and his old drug company because they had a cornered the market on a life-saving drug that people desperately need to stay alive, and they raised the price by 4,000% by engaging in anti-competitive acts. Another example is where you do have a competitive market, like the generic drug industry, but those actors collude with each other and divvy up the market so they can charge higher prices. And I have sued 20 different generic drug manufacturers about their practices involving more than 100 drugs, where they were allocating the market. You can have this drug, I'll have this drug. And in the process, all of us, our drug prices went up. That is absolutely against the law. That's why I brought this action against the generic drug industry. So markets are efficient. They allocate resources well. You have competition that improves the quality, lowers the cost. All of that's great, but for it to work, markets have to be not go to extreme, and that's where government can come in and deal when there's excessive inequality, or there's negative externalities, or there's an imbalance between the parties, or there's anti-competitive or monopolistic behavior. Thank you all.